So just to recap, this very simple thing from Swanson's review, right? You have the motor system that's impacted by sensory information and by cognitive processing, what you're thinking about, and your state, you know, are you hungry or not, and so on. And then you do stuff out in the world because of what gets triggered in your body. Then we could look at it from a more complicated point of view where, you know, information's coming in from the external world, and it's sort of going to all of these different regions almost simultaneously in parallel. You know, so you're remembering what you know about that stuff, you're getting motivated by it, you may be trying to make decisions about what you're doing at the moment or not. You may have a very strong craving for something, but you know that you shouldn't eat it. Now, how many of us have been successful in that area, right? So that, for me, is also a very interesting piece of this whole story, is that these sort of lower level circuitries seem to be extremely powerful. You know, I think that almost everybody in this audience has had some personal experience of doing something that you know that you shouldn't do, and you're doing it anyway. And that might range from watching an episode of The Office to eating a slice of chocolate cake to doing heroin that might kill you, you know, or calling the narcissistic, pathological guy who's never interested in you anyway, but you keep calling him. And I'm not talking about Mark Solms. No, I'm just making a joke. He's talking about narcissism. Okay. So, and so the key aspect of this, right, is that so much of this is happening outside of awareness. And bringing awareness to these processes is part of the process of changing them. Okay, so here's my little way of putting it together again. So the periapodictal gray and the hypothalamus are very much involved with, at least the hypothalamus is involved with monitoring needs. And then both of these structures are generating impulses. The basal ganglia is involved with action selection. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex are involved with relative value. And the amygdala is helping you know about the cues in the environment. And then these structures are involved with sort of more conscious processes and control processes. So anterior cingulate is involved with monitoring conflict and switching your strategies, and talk about the rest of these. So I think that those green areas are primarily involved with drive. These yellow areas are involved with cathexis, and that both of them are strongly involved with the pleasure principle. You know, what Freud talked about in terms of meeting our needs, and generally speaking, the things that meet our needs feel pleasurable to us and reduce our longing for them, you know, which can be felt as tension. And then maybe the reality principle is more based in these structures that are doing all of that sort of monitoring and controlling behavior. Object relations, I think, is sort of like kind of an open field for us to start really thinking about the neural substrates of object relations. And I think some of the things I've said today are sort of a step in that direction. So basically, I think that these very low-level structures are kind of are telling you what you need. And then the higher you go, it's starting to tell you what you need to do to get your needs met. And then at these higher levels still, it's sort of, you know, representing the objects of your drives, you know, what you need to do to fulfill your needs. So that could be source and pressure. Then you could have aim at these sort of mid-level structures. That also feels like a sense of pressure, you know, especially, I mean, people who feel a strong compulsion to do drugs, you know, will tell you that they feel a pressure. They feel like they have to do that thing. And certainly in OCD as well, which I'm not very familiar with. And then here we have object up at the top, which also could be part of what feels like pressure depending on how strongly you've affected a particular thing. And so I think just some final thoughts. I think I've already indicated how much cathexis might be involved with perception, what we're actually seeing and experiencing the world. Then there's also this idea that was raised by Don Tucker and Fan Liu in this interesting paper called Corticolimbic Resonance and the Adaptive Control of Memory. And they're making the argument that the brain is sort of in a constant process of having to balance between maintaining stability in terms of what you've learned already, the connections that are in your brain so that you have a kind of a stable perception of reality, and then on the other hand, plasticity, so that you can learn about new stuff. So if your brain systems are too stable, then you don't have the ability to learn new things. So if you get into a new environment, you're going to be really in a bad condition. On the other hand, if you're too plastic and you just keep learning new stuff all the time and forgetting everything that you ever knew before, that's not very adaptive either. So there's a balance there. And in their paper, they're making the argument that when you're having emotional responses to things in the environment, that activates the hippocampus and other structures that are involved with memory, and your cathexis is involved with telling you what you're going to allow to resculpt your memory or not, which I think also has very strong implications for transference and resistance and for working through. That as we're working in analysis, we're sort of attending to the stuff that would want to eat, no matter how much conscious suffering we're having. We have these very strong associations that are telling us, this is really how you should be. This is how you're going to get your needs met. Don't let go of the hope that X is going to happen. So that is on the side of stability. But in the working through process, hopefully you're facilitating some kind of plasticity and letting in new experiences and letting those sort of reshape those networks. So that's their hypothesis. I think it's a very interesting one, and we can explore it out further. Okay, so I'm done. So I just love this picture. It's the baby saying, "Queens!" And then the cat is saying, "You let him watch another zombie movie, didn't you?" I think it's fun. It's fun to chew on these topics. I guess that's why I'm putting that up there. Okay, so time for discussion.
Maggie. It's more difficult than usual to discuss this paper. Not only because I featured as the superego in it more than once, there's also a sort of accidental allusion to a narcissistic pathological not only for those reasons, but mainly because normally my role as discussant, our presenters are neuroscientists who tell us about their work that they're doing in an area which is of relevance to us in psychoanalysis, and my job is to sort of make the link from the neuroscience to the psychoanalysis. But because Maggie's one of our own, her whole paper was making that link. So I don't really know what my role is in opening the discussion, but I'll try anyway. I mean, just to recap what Maggie's done for us, focusing on the topic of drive and saying at the outset that she's limiting herself to the libidinal, to what we have traditionally referred to in psychoanalysis as the libidinal drive, and deferred the question of other drives to the discussion. So that's one place where I can start to see a role for myself. But she showed us what we know today about the functional neuroanatomy and neurophysiology of this thing in the human brain or in the mammalian brain that performs roughly the function that was assigned to the libidinal drive in classical psychoanalytical theory. And she outlined that aspect of contemporary neuroscience for us. And not only this drive, but also its higher elaborations, particularly in relation to the cathexis of objects by the libidinal drive, and then higher regulatory sort of constraints on that drive as one goes through the higher and higher levels of representation of these drive processes up the neuroaxis. it's a wonderful thing to be able to see, as we have, that we have this knowledge today. I mean, you know, as much as Maggie correctly said, there's a hell of a lot that we don't understand. As you can see, there's also a hell of a lot that we do understand. I mean, we've made absolutely enormous progress compared to where we were a little more than 100 years ago when Freud first introduced this idea of a libidinal drive being the sort of fundamental motor of human behavior. It's not only that we have a relatively detailed neuroscientific conception of this thing, which for short I'm calling the libidinal drive. I say for short because not everyone today would use that term for it. But they might as well, because the most remarkable part of it all is how very similarly this system functions. How very similar is its mode of operation to what Freud conceptualized as the libidinal drive. It's, as Maggie outlined for us, it's rooted in that very early quotation she gave, rooted in our basic bodily needs, represented at the hypothalamic level as need detector mechanisms, which then activates a kind of going out into the world and seeking objects kind of tendency, which is the functional neuroanatomy of which is very well understood. And that this seeking, this wanting, this desire behavior brings us into connection with objects, which then give us, if they're the right objects in relation to the need that activated the system in the first place, give us experiences of satisfaction, what Freud in the Project called experiences of satisfaction. That is to say, simply pleasurable experiences. And again, Maggie pointed out that the wanting, desire part of the system is primarily dopaminergic, and that the pleasures are of a different kind. That's not the libidinal drive system is not a pleasure system, it's a desire system, it's a wanting system. The pleasures, the primarily opiate-driven rewards of actually finding what you want, then makes for these connections between the primary drive system itself and our experience of the world, which leads to these incentive salience links, which Maggie, I thought, rather beautifully pointed out is, and to me it was a surprise, but a compellingly convincing one, that yes, of course, incentive salience has everything to do with what we call cathexis. You know, that's what it is. That there's a kind of objectless drive, and mark that well, that this is one of the, I think, profound ways in which the contemporary neuroscientific knowledge that Maggie's outlined for us squares with the early theorizing of Sigmund Freud and the first generation of psychoanalysts, that this drive not only exists, but that it is in itself objectless, that there isn't a particular type of experience that's inborn that we're looking for, you know, bonking. It's not like that, you know. That was, I think, the natural assumption, certainly it would have been of many people's, the natural assumption that there's a drive for bonking, you know, and that's the libidinal drive, that you go around looking for somebody to bonk, and that feels good and happens to pass on your genes, you know, which is why it's there. What Freud quite surprisingly discovered was that, no, it doesn't seem to be an instinct for drive for bonking. That what it is something much more generalized than that. It's a kind of looking for pleasure, looking for things that might satisfy my needs, and they kind of blur with each other, and the one can stand for the other and stand in for the other in the absence of the other thing, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And so we build up our own personalized set of cathected objects, which is our own objects of libidinal desire, vary enormously from one person to another. And in many of us, you know, sadly from my own experience, I have to say sadly, in many of us it doesn't involve bonking at all. You know. It involves finding God or something. And the fact that what we've learned about this system that Maggie's outlined for us, the fact that we've learned that it functions in exactly that way. It's a sort of generalized object-seeking, motivated from endogenous sources, generalized going out into the world, seeking objects kind of system, which then generates pleasurable experiences, which then
lead to the encoding of the registration of objects that we then desire, which as I say, is our sort of personalized iconography of your own libidinal life. So, to summarize, the fact that we can do that is a remarkable thing, and Maggie's done it for us elegantly, and it's very gratifying. Now, to a more fundamental point, implicit in what I'm saying, it was a shock at the end of the 19th century when Freud suggested that we are driven by drives, like all other animals, that we are animals. That I know it's kind of like obvious, like what else could it be? Of course we must be animals. But it was a shock nonetheless when Freud made this point. And the fact that the knowledge that Maggie's referred to proves the point in the most concrete sort of way. There is a particular network of nuclei with particular chemistries and particular functional properties in the human brain, which is identical to what you find in all other mammalian brains. It functions in the same way. There it is, no denying it. We are animals. We must be. We are. Of course, we always had to be anyway. But now we have concrete, specific information about where exactly our mammalian animal drivenness resides in our brains, and it's incontrovertible. Why was this so important? It's important because we don't think of ourselves as animals. We think of ourselves as having free will and as being these civilized creatures and all of that. And it was in the essence of psychoanalysis that Freud was seeking to get behind all of this, behind this complexity of our socialized existences, to try and find what the rudiments, what the elemental core components are of the engines of our minds, in order to try and find certain universal properties which lawfully determine how human beings behave, just as there are sort of laws governing the behavior of all other creatures. And it was really pretty central to everything that Freud was trying to do, was to try and find those principles, those things that make us tick, those universals. If there is an inbuilt drive system of the kind that Maggie has shown us on the basis of our contemporary knowledge, we really have to accept there is a basic libidinal drive system in us human beings, fundamentally no different from what you find in all other mammals. Then there must be certain consequences for us. There must be certain universal principles that we can infer from this as to what makes the human tick, what the basic elemental motivational properties are of a human mind. Now, a core problem that we face is the very objectlessness of the drive that Freud inferred from his clinical work, and that, as Maggie summarized for us, contemporary neuroscience has also outlined for us. If it is as objectless as that, then the question of what the universals are that it predicts becomes quite problematical. I don't know whether what I'm saying you should nod, Richard, as you normally, when you agree with me, say he's not nodding, maybe I'm not being clear. But to me, that's quite a fundamental point. If the libidinal drive, if this dopaminergic seeking system or wanting system, desire system, is intrinsically objectless, and only acquires the objects of its desire through experience. And I can well understand, retrospectively, not that anyone would have predicted it, but Freud found it, and contemporary affective neuroscience are finding it too, that this objectlessness of it, you can well understand why it should be so. It's eminently biologically sensible to have a system which doesn't desire any particular thing from the outset. It's wonderfully flexible. And it can adjust itself to whatever circumstances it finds itself in. And in this way, with just a kind of a generalized desire for objects and imprinting of those or cathecting of those which satisfy the needs that started the desire in the first place, in this way you build up your own libidinal life, your own erotic world, libidinalized relationship to the world. If it works like that, then there don't necessarily have to be any universals. And many of the basic criticisms of Freudian theory come to mind. I mean, like, for example, the archetypal Oedipus complex, which is supposed to be something absolutely built into our psychology. If there was anything that Freud claimed was a core universal property of human motivation, it was the Oedipus complex. Everything sort of is organized around that. If you look at it in the light of the facts that Maggie summarized for us, then you would have to concede, well, perhaps it's an accident it's a universal experience that we find ourselves with parents, and that our first objects of our desire is likely to be one of them, particularly the nice one, which is the mum. It's not something built into us. It's something which is sort of reinvented, rediscovered by each of us as we go along. I think I personally find that a very interesting prospect in light of what Maggie's summarized for us. If we go a step further down in the Freudian libidinal drive theory, let's not forget that for Freud there was the stages of development of the libidinal drive, something that Maggie didn't refer to at all. There's an oral phase, and an anal phase, and a phallic phase going into this famous Oedipus complex that I just referred to. What is the status of those sorts of concepts today? Do we politely forget them, or embarrassingly not refer to them, or do we say, well, what is the status of these things? I think in the light of the contemporary knowledge that Maggie's outlined for us, it may be that even all of that is not universally necessary in the way that we think of as being in hardwired inbuilt drive. It may be simply that it's in the nature of existence, that the first pleasurable experiences that we have are attached to our bodies, to our mouths to begin with, and then to these other, the anus and the genitals as we go along, and then eventually in relation to the objects who might stimulate these zones of our bodies. Let me just be clear about the very simple point that I'm really making, which is that these two might be accidental cathexis, acquired, reacquired by each one of us, and not necessarily hardwired and inbuilt necessary stages of development of the drive, as it were. So then I have found a few things to say, and now I'm going to say my main thing. I think that if all of that is true, and I find it very plausible and very interesting, then it's also sort of disappointing. So is that all we know, that we have desire? So we're animals and we have desires. So like all the others, big deal. It's not going to really tell us a hell of a lot about human psychology. It ends up being a bit like the behaviorists tell us. It's tabula rasa, and you just learn, and then, give me the baby and I'll make it into anything that I like. That's why I think that we can't stick only to the libidinal drive. Because the really interesting things that are coming out of contemporary affective neuroscience in relation to these sorts of things is the other drives, or instincts, and I think perhaps they deserve better to be called instincts than drives. And Panksepp, who's the preeminent theorist, at least in my book, of all of this stuff, does speak of seeking, which is what Maggie's been talking about primarily, seeking, wanting, desire sort of system, as somehow more basic than the others. But there are others, and they are hardwired. That there is an attachment separation system, what he calls a panic system. That there's a hardwired system which has certain kinds of objects, certain kinds of aims, certain kinds of sources different from the libidinal drive that we've been talking about. And those are, at least in terms of their basic design, hardwired. Certain kinds of experiences are sought by them and activate them and are embedded into them. Attachments and separation, fear, anxiety, different kind of, not panic, but trepidatious anxiety, another system for that, a paranoia kind of system, another one for hot rage, another one for the playing that Maggie showed us, with the tickling of the tummy of the rat. When she said, you see, look, it's cathected Yark's hand. The thing is, yes, but it hasn't cathected it libidinally, maybe it's cathected it playfully. Maybe there's a taxonomy like that. And certainly everything that Maggie showed us about the libidinal drive, everything she outlined for us about what we've learned about it, applies also to these other instinctual systems, that they seem, the most essential thing is that they seem to be just as universally present in all mammalian brains as that libidinal drive system is. And I think that that's really where we should be going as a field at the moment. We should be looking to what can we learn in psychoanalysis by, not only by reveling in the pleasure of finding that our libidinal drive has been rediscovered from an entirely different point of view and works pretty much as we always thought it did, but what can we add to, how can we revise our drive theory in the light of this other layer of theorization that's been introduced by there being an instinctual, hardwired attachment system, a fear system, rage system, and play system, and possibly even, and the play one, by the way, becomes a kind of social hierarchy dominance system, and possibly even a maternal care system somewhat separate from the others. You know, we should look again at our clinical data in the light of those aspects of the contemporary neuroscientific picture to see whether we can't advance drive theory and instinctual theory, and in this way discover, which is really useful knowledge. What are the universals which we, in the human brain, which motivate and organize experience for all of us, no matter what experiences we have? These are certain categories, certain principles that govern the way that we behave. If we can reconfigure our clinical observations on this basis, we'll have a body of knowledge. We already have a body of knowledge emanating from affective neuroscience. But if we can use it in the psychoanalytical situation, in the study of human beings, I think we will have extremely valuable knowledge for reconfiguring the whole of our psychiatric, our whole way of functioning in psychiatry. Replacing DSM-4 with all of its arbitrary categories and grounding our clinical observations on these instinctual and drive systems, which seem to be the real universals, the real, what did you say, carving nature at its joints. This sort of knowledge will be profoundly important for our field. And bring together, in the way that Maggie's shown us is so really eminently possible now, bring together once more, starting from the separation in 1895, bringing together once more psychoanalysis and neuroscience in a way that will advance our field profoundly. So thanks for showing us the way, and that's my discussion, and wasn't super egorish at all, let alone narcissistically. And now, if Maggie wants to respond to that, I'll get the, if you want to, I'll go and get the microphone. Thanks, Maggie.
Very much, Mark. So I do have a couple of comments, and then I'm really interested in questions. But wait, hold on one second. Let me just get back to this. So one thing, just before I forget, and I'm afraid for the immodest implications of this, but I just wanted to announce, if anybody didn't pick up a flyer, that I'm doing a workshop on January 9th at NPAP. It's co-sponsored by NPAP and the Neuropsychoanalysis Foundation on brain basics for the psychodynamically minded. So if you're not sick of hearing me talk and you want some basic neuroanatomy and so on, there's flyers at the back. So, I think it's from a theoretical point of view and also clinical relevance. I think the point that Mark is raising is an important one in terms of how we think about drive, and drive as it relates to these instinctual systems. And I have to say that I haven't been able to think through it clearly enough yet myself. But it's one of the ways of approaching it is that I think that the idea of drive, as we have kind of commonly thought about it, is about registering endogenous need that has to do somehow with deficit and then trying to repair that deficit. You know, so obviously you're hungry, you don't have enough glucose, So you have to seek out food. And it seems like from, in terms of these other systems, it's not necessarily that you have an attachment deficit. You know, the longer that you go without being with somebody that you love, you start to accumulate something like ghrelin. Ghrelin accumulates as you get more hungry. That sensitizes your brain to food stimuli so that you go out and look for food. But it's not clear yet if there's some corresponding thing as that. So there may be temporal courses, because certainly the longer you are lonely, the more hungry you are for contact of a certain kind. So one way of thinking about it is that maybe some of these drives we can think of in terms of homeostatic regulation, that you get sort of a deficit of food and then you need to go out, and it's phasic. And maybe the attachment system, for example, is operating more on a tonic level, that you sort of, no matter what's going on, you sort of need a certain level of contact and support. And that when you have an absence of it, it starts to register as anxiety and unpleasure, and then you're motivated to seek more of it. So that there could be, maybe depending on the system that you're looking at, sort of different set points or so on. So that's one way of thinking about it. And I think that's all I have to say about that. But in terms of the objectlessness of the drive, I'm still not totally sure about that, because it depends on how you look at the system. I mean, I think that it is correct to say probably that at the level of the nucleus accumbens, that the nucleus accumbens is sort of like an all-purpose seeking and learning node. You know, that whatever you need, the nucleus accumbens is going to help you form associations between what's meeting those needs and between the needs and what's going to meet them. But I think that at the level of the hypothalamus, like when I was talking about those different behavioral control nuclei, that those are different systems, that there are different needs that have their own particular objects. So, but on the other hand, whether those reproductive nuclei sort of generate a representation that then make you go out to get that thing that you need, or whether from the other point of view that those sex hormones sensitize the system so that then you go out in the world and you just run around, you're a rat, and then when you happen to come across a female who's wiggling her ears in a very attractive way, then you're going to jump her bones. So I think it depends on what level of the system we're looking at in terms of where the objectlessness resides. I don't know if I'm making that point clear. But that clearly when you get to this level, there are all different kinds of associations that you can make. But on the other hand, you know, when you're hungry, there are objects that are not going to help you reduce your hunger. In the same way as that when you're in separation distress, there are certain things that are not going to meet your separation distress. So I think that the drives do have particular objects, but maybe at this level, it's sort of objectless. So that's one way of beginning to think about it. I don't know that that's really clear or not. So I think that's the main thing I wanted to respond to in terms of Mark. I don't know if you wanted to say anything further. I
will now be the superego. That's what you've just spoken about now, and retreating from this profound thing of objectlessness is I think I don't agree with that. I think that the objectlessness is at the level of the driven behavior, and it's a kind of like anything will do. That's a go without a goal, as Jaak calls it. What you're talking about at the lower level of the need detector systems is the source of the drive. It's not the drive itself. Now here comes Richard Kessler.
Okay. First off, thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm thinking of your connection between cathexis and perception and your research with the Pavlovian experiment with the rat and the like. And I want to try to move you further into Freudian metapsychology and see if I'm following you or you're following me. What you've done when you've created this experiment is you've created a wish in this rat. And the Freudian says a wish to refine this object of satisfaction, this light which has now become associated in memory with motor behavior, that is looking for the pellet, and the satisfaction of the food. So that when this rat is in this experimental situation, in this cage, it has the wish and the expectation, a prediction, okay? That's what's cathectic in its memory, so that it is receptive to light stimuli in that environment. So it attends to that light stimuli because the memory is cathectic of this, that's now a fixed action pattern having to do with the light. Okay? So the cathexis is of the memory. You didn't mention much about memory. It's of the memory, okay, of that previous experimental situation, which means that this light is now meaningful and the light stimuli are meaningful and therefore attended to.
Yeah, that's a good refinement. I would agree with that. I mean, definitely a behavioral neuroscientist would be very nervous about making any speculations about what's going on in the mind of that rat. But I think that it is, and there might be, you know, good neurophysiological ways to talk about it, but it's if I understand your question correctly, you're saying that the rat is hungry, right? Because we food deprive the rat, so they'll be oriented towards the stimuli. And that when we put him in the cage, he's already having an expectation of seeing the light and getting food.
Remember.
Exactly, and that memory sort of primes him to be more attentive to anything that is going to fall into that category. Yeah, and I think that I would agree with that, and I think that that obviously has implications, that's probably happening with all of us in every moment, that when we walk into a given context, we already have expectations about what might or might not happen, what we're wishing will happen, and what we're afraid will happen. And that's an important part of cathexis, yeah.
Next question is serious.
It was great, Maggie. When you were talking about the basal ganglia and its connection to proprioception or learned motor behaviors, unconscious behaviors, and then you made a little trip into transference, and I didn't get the connection. So if you could elaborate that?
Okay, so and it's not my idea, other people have already had the idea, but the idea being that that your basal ganglia is sort of regulating habitual motor patterns in relation to recognized stimuli, right? To put that in very simplistic terms. So that when I walk by the refrigerator, I'm inclined to open it. When I get on the bus, I hold my Metro card in a certain way. Those are all very discrete kind of motor patterns. But there's also the idea that procedural memory has to do with ways of being with particular people. So that when you're with a particular person, you have certain expectations for how they're going to behave and how you're going to behave. And that it's not just basal ganglia, but that basal ganglia is part of the system that's mediating that set of expectations. And sort of my idea would be that sort of in a certain situation, you're more likely to sort of inhibit a whole set of behaviors and you're more likely to release another set of behaviors.
And it's unconscious.
Yeah, I think that it's mainly operating out of consciousness. Now, how that relates to cognitive processes, sort of what you allow because I think that's a different level, kind of what you allow yourself to think and attend to, that probably is not, basal ganglia might interact with those processes, but those could be an entirely different level. And the question, I heard the other.
I want to follow up on the series of remarks. With all the information you gave us, there was one phrase that I'd like to address. It had to do with projective identification. In the 70s and the 80s, in psychoanalysis, projective identification was debated on and on, as it still is. People almost got tired of the argument. But it really came down to the one phrase you used, and that was that the person projects into. Now, the arguments in psychoanalysis are that it's impossible to project into another person. That literally this is something that needs to be broken down in terms of neuroanatomy. We project onto it. We have a perception that we are projecting onto it. And as the person then, after projecting, does something, it's the object that allows the induction. And I wonder if you might break that down in terms of brain structure from that perspective.
So I can only say just a couple of kind of speculative things. But first of all, if I said projected into, I really meant to say projected onto. So that, yeah, I don't think that there's any sort of mystical way that you can actually put something into someone else's subjectivity. But that, to be more specific from a psychodynamic point of view first, and then I'll see if I can make any speculations about the brain, is that if I'm having a feeling that's unacceptable to me, I will then attribute it to my representation of the other. That's the, in other words, I project it onto them so that then I start to perceive or experience that other person as having that set of feelings. Then, behaviorally, I may actually start to act towards that person. So, for example, I might be afraid that someone is going to be angry at me, so therefore I procrastinate on doing something, and I'm late giving them something they're expecting me to give them, and then they do get angry at me. So that's just on a purely behavioral level. I mean, I think we could break down the brain processes in that. There also could be more subtle transactions where if somebody is attributing dangerousness to me and they're behaving towards me as if I'm dangerous, and they start to act in an extremely timid or paranoid way, I might actually start to feel irritated or hostile towards them. And I think that on a behavioral level, that could be me picking up subtle facial expressions. And there are certain facial expressions that are hardwired to trigger emotional processes that then go to the facial muscles. And that then, that's sort of the point of contact, right? So that I start to pick up on their facial cues, it triggers a certain set of feelings in me that then generates new facial cues in me that then they pick up. So I think that on the behavior, that would be one of the substrates of that process.
Biological principles at work in the mind, and you really are you are lurching around in the dark. Now, this is the great advantage of what's happened in recent decades or years in the case of affective neuroscience, is that we now have methods by which we can, in a far from arbitrary way, differentiate what the different basic drive systems are. It's very far from the observational surface of clinical psychoanalysis what the sources and fundamental natures of our biological existence are. But you look at the relationship between body and brain, and you sort of say, okay, well, this one seems to do that, and you do little experiments, and you find out, okay, well, here's one system, here's another one, here's another one. And on the basis of that sort of work, the current thinking, at least the avant-garde of the current thinking, is that there is a basic sort of libidinal drive of the kind that Maggie described for us, which responds to, exactly as that Freud quote said, bodily needs activated, and then the animal goes out and looks for something. It doesn't exactly know what until it learns, till it cathexis particular objects. It just knows whatever I need, it's out there, and that's what this drive does. It says, go forth. That's where it is. The things that you need, sadly, you haven't got them. They're out there. You have to relate to objects. So that much is very similar to the Freudian libidinal drive. But then there are other systems which are also, all of these systems are selected into the human genome and the mammalian genome because they help our reproductive fitness. It's a jolly good thing to look out there in the world for the things that you want. If you haven't got a gene that makes you do that, you kind of had it. You've had it in a very brief moment of narcissistic bliss, and then you're gone. So, but there are other things which likewise enhance our reproductive fitness, like not having to learn from the beginning. That when a lion's coming at you with teeth and nail claws, that you don't sort of wait and say, well, let me learn from this experience, and then next time I'll know what to do. So this is those animals who are born with the tendency when something's rushing at you with gnashing teeth and exposed claws, run. Don't wait to learn about it. That's an instinct. It's a stereotyped, inbuilt, hardwired tendency. And the literature that Maggie's summarized for us today also includes a similar kind of knowledge that she's told us about the libidinal drive. It shows us that there are other inbuilt tendencies like that. The one I've referred to here is the fear one. But there's one also for panic and separation, attachment behaviors. There's another one for play and social dominance behaviors, and so on. So in Freudian theory, these tendencies are derived from a fundamental libidinal drive in relation to experiences with the world and in relation to the destructive drive. So these two drive tendencies in because we have this much, which was not available in Freud's time. Freud's great problem was the arbitrariness of it. Is there a drive for McDonald's and another one for Starbucks and another one for television, and especially this program, and who's to say? So that's why he was always appropriately very cautious about his classification. But because we now have methods which are not arbitrary, which show that this system exists, it's got this chemistry, it has these properties, it exists in all mammals, there's pretty good evidence that this is a basic instinctual mechanism. And I'm saying, well, we should look at our clinical work.
That if you experience certain kinds of stimuli, your amygdala will send signals to your hypothalamus and down into your brainstem so that you will emit, let's say, a fear response or an angry response. Some of those things are just hardwired. You don't have to learn about them. And then other things, you can learn about them. So certain things will make you angry based on your experience. And then your amygdala can activate the system from a different node. So the big picture is that those feeling a need and then responding to things that will fulfill that need, the system can be activated from different nodes. You could just be in a fairly neutral state and smell a delicious meal and all of a sudden be in the mood to eat when you weren't actually hungry, for example. So that's just one, and then if you have top-down control telling you what you should and shouldn't do in any given state, even if your amygdala is saying, run, my scary boss is here, but your cortex is saying, like that wouldn't be cool, you have to act normal right now, then you won't run, even if your hypothalamus is sending stress signals down to your body. So that's one way of reframing, I think, what you were asking.
Thank you again very much. A wonderful effort of integration. I wanted to address the question of objectlessness of the drive. The question of objectlessness of the drive. Is it more apparent than real? In other words, is it that there is no object, or that the object is actually built in at birth? The mother is there, which kind of relates to Freud's concept of primary narcissism, which is a stage of object relations. And so that, so the object is not yet constituted in a way in the perception of the infant, and perhaps in fact some of the development is exactly to constitute that kind of an object, maybe through the libidinal phases, so that if there is a organization of experience through these experiences of eating and satisfaction and the connection with the object, that that's another ingredient, and that's the ingredient of where actually the object is in the economy of the attending to the bodily needs.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear that the concept of objectless drive, that's what Marx said in his commentary. I'm very agnostic about whether there's such a thing as objectless drive. So I'm not saying that. is saying that. I think Mark thinks that I should be saying that. But I think that, you know, if you look at just infant research, like you're saying, that there's strong evidence that we're oriented towards facial stimuli, that the baby will have certain responses to the mother's voice and so on. And that doesn't have anything to do with the experience of being fed. It doesn't have anything, it's its own need, so to speak, for that kind of relatedness. And so I just wanted to be clear that I'm not sure if objectless drive is a well-substantiated term yet, or whether we have to look at it in terms of sort of the different circuits.
And in support of what Hugo was saying, how do we explain the marasmic babies, for example, that they stop feeding? And we don't have orphanages anymore, but there's plenty of evidence. How do you think about that? The food-seeking drive disappears.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so familiar with that literature, but I mean, basically, in terms of infant regulation, you know, at least in rodents, and I think to a certain extent in infants, you know, we do know that there are different kinds of stimuli that can regulate the baby's physiology. You know, like I said, the smell of the mother, the sound, the feeling of being held, the experience of being fed, all of those different things sort of feed into the system. And I guess the question is, and it seems like it's sort of a hot theoretical question since several people are referring to it, is do you start out sort of knowing the things that are going to meet your needs, or do you have to learn about them?
Well, maybe Mark
and I think that, right, and I think that there's evidence for both.
Yes?
Yeah.
Mark, how do you think about those babies?
Well, as Maggie has so politely reminded us, it's her presentation and not mine, so I'm nervous to say too much. I'm going to be very brief. I'll just say, first of all, it's not my concept, objectless drive, it's Freud's concept. The objectlessness that I'm referring to has to do with the part of our, under this system, the part of our contemporary knowledge, which seems to do the same work in the mental apparatus as Freud's libidinal drive concept did in his conceptualization of the mind, which is it's an all-purpose wanting system, all-purpose desire system, seeking system, all-purpose appetite system. That's probably a very good word for it. But then the same knowledge, the same literature, refers also to other systems, which seem to be nested over this one. There seem to be, this is a more basic system, that over that there seem to be a number of other instinctual systems. And to translate it into the terminology of objectlessness or not, what that literature refers to is that no, there are certain primal categories of object that we have preconceptions of. That there are innate objects that we respond to in certain, that we cathect according to innate categories. There's a pleasure-giving object that's related to a pleasure-lust system in the brain. And which is separate from an attachment object. So that you'll cathect this one as a pleasure object, this one as an attachment object. It might be the same person, but you'll have two different systems, you know, that cathect her. And then there's a fear object. And then there's a rage-inducing object. And then there's a social dominance object. You know? So objects are categorized and cathected according to those different systems which have preconceived properties. So that, you know, it's not just a random seeking for objects, finding certain ones fulfill certain desires and then cathecting them. That it's more elaborated than that. At the Freudian level of metapsychology, those are instincts, and he uses the term. Strachey's translation confuses the matter terribly. Because the German term Trieb is what we're talking about here. And then there's the German word instinct, which is instinct and versus drive. And Freud says very clearly that this refers to what we might think of as primal fantasies, certain inbuilt representational contents. And I'm saying that this literature, the contemporary knowledge, sort of makes good reason for us to perhaps rethink all of that and to look at our clinical experience in the light of this alternative taxonomy. And that's it. But in relation to these babies, I mean, the fundamental observation that led to the discovery of this system was that there was an electrode put into the rat brain, into the nucleus accumbens. No, yes, into the shell of the nucleus accumbens, stimulating this system. And the rat had a choice whether to push this lever, all that it does is stimulates its wanting system, or to push that lever and get water and pellets and live. And it chose rather to stimulate this thing till the point of starvation and death. Which is a profound piece of evidence for there being a system which just wants, separately from the satisfactions that can be attained by it. Is there one last question? Yes, there is, from Larry Kinstein.
Maggie, first I'd like to concur with everybody else that this was a really excellent presentation. I'd like to elaborate a bit on Richard Kessler's question about memory. I think there's a big difference between the way cognitive people see memory and the way psychoanalysts see memory. For cognitive people, usually, they're talking about memory as though it's some kind of a record of an event, an episodic memory. So you can have a memory, let's say when I'm 5 years old, I stick my hand in the cookie jar, my mother catches me and sends me to my bedroom. That's an episodic memory. I think Freud's great discovery in this area is that he saw memory as part of a motivational system. That memory is part of a system that causes you to look for a moment of satisfaction again and again and again. The idea is to keep repeating it. What I'd like to try to understand, because I haven't been able to find it in the literature, is there an anatomical difference between these two systems? And where would you locate memory? And how does it become part of the motivational system? The cognitive people talk about the hippocampus as laying down long-term memory from short-term memory in the temporal cortex, but if that's so, how does that get into the motivational system that pushes you out into the outside world to repeat in ways that are often not very beneficial?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the basic answer, I would say, the beginnings of an answer to that, right, are that you have several different basic types of memory. So amygdala is thought to mediate emotional memory, sort of the formation of stimuli, regardless of context. And the hippocampus is important for binding together elements of a situation so that you can have a conscious memory of it, an episodic memory. And then remembering how to do something, procedural memory, is basal ganglia. But remember, right, that they're all talking to each other all the time. So presumably, and I don't know very much of the literature at all on sort of the generation of mental representations and sort of mental representations out of awareness affecting behavior, but presumably, you have all kinds of representations that the state of being, for example, the state of feeling a need, or feeling lonely, or feeling like you want a boyfriend, or feeling hungry, or whatever, that state is going to activate particular kinds of representations, based on past experience. Those representations may have access to ventral striatum and the basal ganglia more generally to trigger certain kinds of motivations, to select certain kinds of behaviors. So all of the nodes are connected to each other. So that would be my first pass. That you can separate the systems sort of in terms of brain lesions and injecting chemicals into animals in different parts, but in a healthy functioning brain, they're all connected to each other. So presumably need can trigger a memory for what will fulfill that need, and you could be not in a particular need state, but encounter something that triggers the memory that then could trigger a sense of wanting. So I think that it can go in different directions, if that starts to explain that. So shall we wrap up?
Yep, it's time. So, look here, I'm hugging her. You can't legislate for other people's superegos. I actually discovered her, and I think I'm very, very proud of her. Well done, Maggie. Brief administrative points before we stop. The first one is that our next meeting, of course, we don't meet on the 3rd of January or wherever it is, the first Saturday in January. Our next meeting is the first Saturday in February, 6th of February to be specific, and our speaker is Oren Davinsky from NYU, a super duper expert on seizure disorders, and I'm assuming he's going to be speaking mainly about complex partial seizures, which are in fact a unique source of evidence of human instinctual behaviors. So I'm really looking forward to that presentation, and would encourage you to come to it. And last administrative comment is that our board, our foundation board, under the chairmanship of Maggie, is meeting upstairs at 1 p.m.
Yes,
Right?
20 minutes.
In 20 minutes, at 10 minutes, huh? 10 to 1. Thank you again, Maggie.